Here is where we dive deep into the main component for triggering and controlling audio in Unity, the audio source. Once we're finished here, you'll know them and all of the options that they provide like the back of your hand. We'll also be introducing ourselves to some fundamental game audio concepts that we'll be using later on in this course, so we better get started. Okay, so we'll be continuing off from the project that we've been using so far and using the audio source attached to the practice object to learn from. Now obviously we already know the purposes of the audio clip, the play on awake, and the loop options as we learnt about them in the last lesson. So let's make our way down the list, starting with the output section. The output section utilizes Unity's audio mixer system and allows us to create a signal path for all of the sounds we have in our game and send our music to a bus that we can create. Later in this course, we'll be creating audio mixers to fill this role. Audio mixers are their own type of Unity asset, just like the audio clips. Just like traditional mixers and routing options, you can send your audio to them, adjust their output, and even add digital signal processing effects to them. But for now, mixers and buses are things we'll be looking at later on in more detail. Now next is a simple mute toggle. You can set your audio to begin muted if you wish, but it's unlikely that you intend to leave it muted for the entirety of the game. That's why the mute toggle and most of the other properties we're about to look at can be set to adjust or change using C# scripts at runtime. Next up is bypass effects. As well as the audio source component, Unity provides us with a few basic digital signal processing effects in the form of components that can be attached to any game object, provided that the game object has an audio source already attached to it. Now the quickest way to see these effects is by clicking the Add Component button on an object and typing the word audio into the search bar, which shows us the options we have to choose from. So let's say that we wanted to add a low pass filter to our music. Well, in that case, we'd simply select the audio low pass filter and add it to our component. We can now set a frequency that we'd like to filter our music to, as well as a resonance amount that we'd like to add to our filter band. So let's give this a test by setting the low pass filter to about 3000 and then playing our game. And as you can hear straight away, our music has been filtered. You can also make adjustments to these settings whilst the game is running to compare and test any changes you'd like to make to them. So for example, if we change the cutoff frequency to 1000, we can hear the filter effect has been applied with even more intensity. Note, however, that these changes you've made whilst the game is running won't be saved once you've finished playing the game, so make sure you remember what you've changed if you wish to keep them. If we look back at the cutoff frequency field, you can see that it's returned to 3000 because we changed it to 1000 whilst the game was playing. Anyway, going back to our bypass effects toggle, marking this box as true will disable any digital signal processing effects that you've added to this game object. So despite the fact that we've still got our audio low pass filter attached to this object, let's have a listen to our music one more time. As you can hear, the filter is no longer applied, but if we untick the toggle, we can hear it again. Now underneath bypass effects, we have bypass listener effects. Now in Unity, the most important audio component by far is called the audio listener component, which if we select our main camera object, we can see is attached to it at the bottom of the inspector tab. Now an audio listener is like a reference point. Wherever this object is in our game world is where our player is going to hear our audio from. It's the perspective from which they hear all of the game's sounds and music from. If the camera acts as the player's eyes, then the audio listener essentially acts as the player's ears. This allows us to create 3D audio using the location of the audio listener and the difference between it and our audio source to make changes to our audio. But that's something we'll be looking more at by the end of the lesson. The reason why I'm addressing the audio listener now is because just like with our audio source, we can add digital signal processing effects to it. Think of the audio listener in this sense as the last channel of a door's signal chain. That's how sounds need to pass through in order to come out of the listener's speakers. Any digital signal processing effects we add to the listener will be applied to all of the audio we pass through it. So let's add an echo or a delay effect to the audio listener and play the game. So as you can hear, a delay has been added to our music. But if we go back to the audio source and we tick the bypass listener effects toggle, we no longer hear the echo. If we had other audio sources in our game playing their own sounds or music, provided that their bypass listener effect toggle was marked false, the echo would still be applied to those sounds. The toggle below that is called bypass reverb zone. Now, some of these settings I'd like to address in more of a video game development context to help you fully understand how they work and how to use them. So I'm going to show you how you can set up reverb zones in a future lesson. And whilst I'm sure you can imagine what bypass reverb zone will do for our music, know that if our practice object was within range of a reverb zone in our game, the music we're playing would be reverberated. But by marking this toggle, no reverb is applied. Now, whilst we've already used play on awake, let's look at it in a little bit more depth. The term awake refers to the moment that something has become active or has first started. When our game is first told to play by our player, it checks through all of the game objects within itself to see if they're activated. Now, you may have noticed in the top left corner of our game object in the Inspector tab, next to its name, there is a toggle box. Now, by default, it is set to true, meaning that this object will be activated or will be on when the game is running, allowing all of the components attached to it to do whatever it is that they've been told to do. We can, of course, set it to false, preventing it from showing up in our game and preventing all of its attached components from doing anything. So whilst the game and our music is playing, or even before, we can turn the object off or turn it on. And just like we can turn objects on and off, we can do the same to each individual component attached to the object, such as the audio source. So by marking the play on awake toggle as true, the audio within our audio source will play so long as both the game object and the audio source itself are enabled. Play on awake is commonly used to play sounds and music as soon as the game starts, like we've been doing. But by setting the game object or the audio source to deactivate when the game starts, and then setting them to activate during a specific moment within the game using C#, you can also use Play on awake to play music and sounds for a more specific purpose. Now, the last toggle we have left on our list is called loop, but seeing as we know what it does and that it's a pretty straightforward one, let's move straight on to priority, our first slider. Now, as you can see, because priority is our first slider, we can adjust the value we set it to between a range of two values. Priority is tied with Unity's max real voices and max virtual voices settings, which you can find and change by clicking Edit, Project Settings, and Audio. Now, by default, max virtual voices will be set to 512 and max real voices will be set to 32. Now, we'll be looking at the relationship between priority, voice counts, and their effect on your audio system overall in our lesson on Unity's audio settings menu. So for now, we'll be focusing mostly on how priority affects each individual audio source. So if there are more audio sources playing at once than the number of max real voices, then Unity will check the priority level of all of our audio sources to see which ones need to be made virtual. Now, a virtual voice or sound is one that is still playing by Unity's audio engine, but won't actually be heard by the player. So to demonstrate this, I've set up a near identical project to ours. Now this is just a demonstration, so don't worry about copying anything for now. In it, what I've done is I've set my max real voices setting to 1, but I've added 2 game objects, both with their own audio source attached to them. Each audio source also has its own distinct audio clip, so each one will play a different piece of music. Now the first audio source, which has a priority of just 1, is going to play our original music file, but the other, which has a priority level of 2, is going to play a new piece of music. Now the audio source with the lowest priority level will be prioritized over the other. So if I now play my game, we should hear our original music, whilst the new music will still be playing, but we won't actually be able to hear it as it's been made virtual. And as you can hear, that's exactly what happens. But now if I switch their priority values the other way around, we should instead hear the new piece of music and not our original. So let's change the audio source from 2 to 1 for the second object. And for the first, we'll change the priority from 1 to 2 and give it another test. And there you are, we now hear a new piece of music. Now what happens if the max amount of real voices is reached and Unity finds that there are more than one audio sources in your project that share the same highest priority? Well, to decide which one to keep and which ones to make virtual, Unity will look at their audibility level and will choose the voices with the lowest level. To sum up audibility briefly, it is the combination of the audio source's volume, distance attenuation, and level of the mixer it may be routed to. But because this is more of a mixing term, we'll look at it in greater detail later on. You'll also find underneath this video an article that explains some good guidelines to follow when using priority, as well as many other great tips and explanations for audio sources. Okay, so that's the demonstration out of the way, so let's move back on dissecting our audio source. Now volume is nice and straightforward. When set to 1, your audio clip will be played at its maximum volume, and when set to 0, it will be dropped to -infinity decibels. Pitch is another nice and easy one to understand. Unity lowers and increases the pitch of your audio clips by speeding them up and slowing them down. A value of 1 does nothing. A value of 0 slows the sound down to a complete stop, and a max value of 3 multiplies the playback speed of our sound by 3. Let's have a quick listen to our music when pitch is set to 3. As you can hear, it's been sped up quite a lot. Let's also have a listen to it at 0. As you can hear, it's been slowed down to a complete stop. And then anything below 0 will actually play our sound backwards. Next, StereoPan simply adjusts the position of the sound in the stereo mix of your game. Now, this setting isn't really something you'll want to adjust when working with 3D sounds, as you'll see why later on, but for 2D sounds, such as our music, where its position in relation to our audio listener doesn't really affect the volume or its pan, it can become very useful. Just move the dial to either the left or the right side of the slider to adjust the mix. And as I'm sure you know, this effect will be easier for players to identify if they're using headphones. Let's quickly have a listen to what it sounds like when we adjust it. Okay, so if we move the slider to the left, we hear it in our left channel, and if we adjust it to the right, we hear it in our right channel. Now, Spatial Blend is a very important tool, as this is what's going to change our audio clip from being played back as a 2D sound to a 3D sound. Now, for you to fully hear the effect that we're about to discuss, I recommend you listen to the rest of this lesson through headphones if you're not already. So if we adjust the Spatial Blend slider from 2D to 3D, the volume and the pan of our sound will now be adjusted based on its distance and position from the game object that has our audio listener attached to it, like we mentioned earlier. To test this, let's change the position of our main camera in our world. To do that, we can scroll up to the transform component, which will be the top component in the inspector tab, and let's change the Z position of the object from -10 to about -2 to bring it closer to our practice object, which should be, if we click on that, at 0 on the X, 0 on the Y, and 0 on the Z. Now, if we play the game with the spatial blend slider starting at 2D and adjust it to 3D whilst the game is playing, have a listen to what happens to the two channels that make up our stereo music track. So if I slowly adjust it from 2D to 3D, we start to hear that what we're actually doing is adjusting our mix between our original stereo music and a mono down mix version of it. The further we set our audio source to 3D, the more we hear the mono mix. In order to create the 3D effect, any audio with more than one channel, like a stereo file, is down mixed to make it more clear to the player where in the space of the game world the sound is supposed to be coming from. This is why sounds created for a 3D space are typically designed and rendered as mono rather than stereo. And whilst we can still use stereo files in 3D, for example, you might have a game with a radio in a room playing music, it's worth being aware of this in case the music you're using hasn't been mixed well for mono, as phasing issues may be heard. So with our music now set to 3D, let's move our practice object along the X-axis by setting its transform position to 5 on the X. By setting it 5 units of distance away from the listener, we should hear two things. Not only has the volume slightly dropped, but we can now only hear it coming from one channel. For me, it's coming through the right channel, or through my right ear, because my practice game object is positioned to the right of my main camera, which again has the audio listener attached to it, in relation to the direction it is facing, which is this way. We can also change the position of our practice object by clicking, holding and dragging the arrows coming off of it in the Scene tab. Let's have a quick listen to how we can change the sound by moving its position. Feel free to experiment yourself with different positions for the camera and the practice object to get a better feel for how these changes in position affect a 3D sound. Underneath Spatial Blend, we have Reverb Zone Mix. Now again, we're not going to look at reverb zones just yet, but for now, know that the Reverb Zone Mix adjusts how much signal is routed into any reverb components that your audio source might be in range of, where 0 is not at all, 1 is fully, and the max value, which is 1.1, adds a 10 decibel boost to the signal for some extra reverb. So now we move on to the final group of settings, all of which will affect your audio clip if you've decided to make it 3D. So let's go through them. Now I'm sure you already know what the Doppler effect is, and from that you can work out what the Doppler level slider does, but in case you don't, I will quickly explain it. The Doppler level slider, if set to a value higher than 0, will adjust the pitch of your audio clip whenever it moves towards or away from your audio listener in the game. Now, if you experimented with the position of your game object whilst we were looking at the spatial blend slider, you may have noticed that the pitch of your music was changing whenever you moved the object. That's thanks to the Doppler level slider, as its default value is 1, as you can see here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my practice project to start at x equals -20, and I'm going to set the spatial blend slider to 3D, and I want you to have a listen to what happens to the music when the object moves past the audio listener. As you just heard, as the practice object moves past our listener, Unity simulates what it might sound like in real life if a loud object moving at a fast speed travelled past you. For example, the sound of a racing car passing you by. Let's also have a listen to what happens if I set the Doppler level to a higher value, such as 3. So as you've just heard there, the changes in pitch are a lot more intense now. As the object moved closer to our audio listener, our music rose in pitch by quite a high amount and then dropped in pitch as it moved away. So a good use for the Doppler level slider is for any objects that might move very fast in your game whilst playing back one of your audio clips. Now, depending on how many channels you plan on outputting your game's audio to, stereo, 1.5, 7.1, etc., the spread slider can get a little bit tricky to understand. When listening through a stereo system, however, it's thankfully pretty simple. When at its default value of 0, the level at which your audio is played through both channels depends on its position in the game world. So for example, our practice object is still sitting to the left of our camera object and therefore our listener component. And so because of this, the level of our music in the left channel of either our headphones or our stereo speakers is quite high and quite low in the right channel. But as we start to increase the spread, the balance between the two channels is starting to become more even. And once we reach 180, the panning of our sound is now no longer determined by the position of it in the game space. So now it's returned to just playing through both channels at equal levels. Now that's not to say that our sound is now 2D again, mind you, because whilst its position no longer affects the panning of the sound, it still affects its volume. Now this might seem at first like an odd option to have control over, but it actually becomes very useful for making the size of a sound effect more like how it would sound in real life. For example, if I were to blindfold you and ask you to throw a glass bottle about 45 degrees to your right, you would hear the sound of the glass smashing from a very specific point. If I asked you to then point to where you heard the smash, chances are that you'd be able to point your finger almost exactly at where the bottle smashed. However, if you were to throw a grenade in the same direction, the sound of the explosion would sound as if it were coming from a much larger, more general space than the glass bottle. This example, by the way, is assuming that we heard both sounds at the same amplitude and that the grenade obviously didn't deafen or kill us both. If I then asked you to point to where you think the grenade was when it exploded, you'd be able to point within a general area of the explosion, but the exact point would be hard to determine. Using the spread slider, we can decide how wide we want each audio clip to sound. Do we want them to be heard from a specific point, like the glass bottle? Or do we want our sounds to feel large and as if they cover a wide area of our game, such as a grenade explosion? Now, beyond 180 is where things start to get a little bit weird. The channel levels are now going to be rebalanced, but in the opposite direction. So now, even though our practice object is positioned to the left of our camera, it will start to sound like it's coming from the right. And once we hit 360, the levels will be set to the complete opposite of what they were when we started. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the effects that the spread slider has when creating a game that can be played on a surround sound system, such as 5.1 or 7.1, I'll have a link underneath this lesson to help you out. You'll find some notes from a group who tested its effects using 7.1 audio files to help you understand it further. Okay, so we're nearly finished with examining the audio source. The last three settings that we can change, as well as the graph below them, all have an effect on a sound's distance attenuation. Distance attenuation is basically the process of changing the character of a sound based on its distance from the listener. And we've somewhat discussed some basic ways to use distance attenuation already, but with these settings below, we're about to control it with a lot more precision. Now let's start with the min and max distance settings because they're the simplest to understand. So as we've already discovered, the volume of our sound will decrease the further it moves away from the listener. Well, the min and max distant values allow us to adjust how far the sound must be from the listener before the sound starts to drop off and before it drops off completely. Now, the min distance is how far the sound must be from the listener before the volume starts to decrease. By default, it is set to 1. So if the distance between our practice and our camera objects is less than 1 unit, the volume won't change. The max distance, on the other hand, is how far the sound must be from the listener before the sound's volume is completely dropped to -infinity decibels. By default, it is set to 500. And as we've already heard, if we move our two objects apart further than 1 but less than 500 units of distance, then volume attenuation will be applied. So now we know how to control when the volume starts to roll off, but what if we want to control by how much it rolls off? Well, that's where both the graph you see below and the volume roll off setting comes into play. By changing which type of volume roll-off curve we want to work with, we can control how much the volume is reduced as the distance between the sound and the listener changes. If we leave it set to logarithmic roll-off, then the volume roll-off will follow this steep decline that we can see on the graph currently. The values on the y-axis of the graph represent the volume or any other property that we might want to be attenuating. At its max amount, when at the top, it is at 1, and its minimum, when at the bottom, is 0. The values on the x-axis represent the distance between the sound and the listener. Finally, the marker labelled listener at the top tells us how far the listener is from this particular audio source, and thus how that will affect our sound's volume and other properties. Now, if I temporarily set the x value of our practice object to 200, you can see how the marker has moved further along the graph, telling us what the new volume of our sound will be set to. Let's quickly have a listen to see what that sounds like as the distance increases. So as the object begins to move closer to the camera and the audio listener, we hear it louder. And there we go. You can see when it got really close, it basically followed this curve we can see on the graph, and then once it passed that threshold, it returned the other way. Now, rather than a logarithmic curve, we can set our volume attenuation to match a linear curve instead by simply opening the drop-down menu and selecting linear roll-off. Now you can see that the volume is going to attenuate much more evenly over distance. Again, let's have another listen to how that sounds. So that time the roll-off was a little more steady and consistent. Finally, our last roll-off setting allows us to customize not only the amount by which the volume drops, but the rate too. So now, if we double-click anywhere on this red line, we can add a point to our curve and adjust it exactly when and by how much our volume drops off. So I'm just going to pick some random points on this curve and add them and make a few adjustments by changing the angle of some of these curves. Now, whilst there isn't much cohesion to these points I've added, let's have a listen to what our volume attenuation now sounds like. You can also control other properties using attenuation by following the key below and making changes to the different coloured lines on the graph. Now, for example, you might want a particular sound to feel very large when far away from the listener, but very small when up close. To do that, we can control the spread setting from the graph. Let's now set it to about 0.5 or half of its max value, which remember would be 180 degrees when the sound is furthest away. And also set it to 0 when the sound is at its closest, like that. So for one final time, let's have a listen to what our music sounds like in our game. And with that, we've covered all of the settings and options we have control over inside of our audio source component. Now, before we call the lesson, here's a few final tips for you. You can use the scroll wheel on your mouse whilst holding right click to zoom into the graph. You can then click and hold the mouse wheel to navigate around it, and you can also highlight multiple points on the graph with the left mouse button, so you can make multiple edits at once. Right, and with that, we're now one step further to mastering Unity's audio system. In the next lesson, we'll be looking at the audio settings menu that we briefly saw in this lesson. The audio settings menu sets key principles that all of our audio must adhere to, but more on that in the next lesson. Now, we've already covered a lot so far, so if you don't feel like moving on just yet, then I encourage you to import some more audio into your project and then mess around with some more audio sources to help you fully understand what each of the options that we looked at in this lesson do within the context of a game. Once you feel confident with the majority of them, head over to the next lesson.